Welcome to Kev Talks, Real World Global Logistics. I'm Kevin Parkerson.
And I'm Kevin Higgins. Together we bring you over 60 years in combined experience in global logistics.
In each episode, we'll dive into the latest industry trends, share practical tips, celebrate wins, and share stories from the logistics front lines, all while helping businesses optimize their logistics operations. Welcome to Kev Talks, Real World Global Logistics, the podcast where we unpack the complexities of global trade and logistics with the industry's leading minds. I'm your co-host, Kevin Parkerson, and he's Kevin Higgins, and today we have an incredible episode lined up. Joining us is none other than Jason Miller, the Eli Broad Professor of Supply Chain Management at Michigan State University. With a PhD from the Ohio State University, Jason is a leading expert in the intersection of economics and supply chain management. His insights have been featured in major outlets like the Wall Street Journal, CBS, Bloomberg, and ABC. And he's a frequent guest on industry webinars, making him one of the most respected voices in the field. Today's episode, titled Tariffs Unpacked, Navigating Global Trade Shifts with Jason Miller. This dives into the evolving landscape of tariffs, trade policies, and their implications for businesses across the globe. From the rising tariffs rates on Chinese imports to the potential impact of new policies targeting North America trade, we'll explore what these changes mean for importers, exporters, and supply chain professionals. So whether you're a seasoned logistics expert or just looking to stay ahead in the rapidly changing industry, this episode is for you. So let's get started.
All right, we're going to bring on Jason.
Hey, guys.
Hey, Jason, welcome.
Hey, Jason.
Welcome. I'm not sure about that most respected thing or whatnot. Certainly, probably people think opinionated.
Well,
good. That's what we want to get. We want to get your opinions because I think they're well rooted in data as well. So we're really excited to have you, for this discussion. A lot of attention is on this topic, and I think there's been a lot of already podcasts and webinars, and there'll continue to be. But having you here to discuss it with us in your perspective is going to be really, really good. So we're excited.
Yeah, absolutely. I just so much. I'm looking forward to it because I've been doing this for a long time. So has KP, but there's so much confusion around tariffs in general, and so I look forward to dispelling some of the mess and just getting to facts on what's going on, how they work and things like that. So I'm incredibly excited about this episode.
Yeah. So, Jason, before we get into, the heart of the topic, I would like to ask, in your world today, so professor, academia, what's going on? What outside of tariffs, are people talking about holiday planning? Are they talking about the Spartans? What's going on in your world outside of tariffs?
Yeah, so it's funny you mention that. So usually a lot of my research, actually funny enough, I'm only involved with one paper involving tariffs, and that's being led by a former doctoral student of mine. Most of the research I actually do is on motor carrier safety, funny enough. So that's where I've published a lot of work. We're still looking at things, how did the ELD mandate affect the industry? It shifted, for example, a lot of for-hire owner-operators over to become subcontractors if their trucks were just above the engine threshold where you had to have an ELD versus the ones who weren't, where they didn't care and nothing changed. Understanding like the DOT's inspection blitzes and how things like that work. So, is behavior today different from what it was back, before ELDs? How does it vary with market conditions and things like that? So I do a lot of research in that space. And then teaching wise, I teach a couple different courses here. One's on distribution fulfillment, so focuses a lot on international trade, trucking, intermodal, wholesaling, retailing, so the omni-channel e-commerce aspects. And then another course on analytics. So very much kind of diving in and teaching the students about some of these different data sources that exist, teaching how to do forecasting, seasonal adjustment, and things of that sort.
Wow, you just hit on a lot of topics, and I think we could have you back
Dude,
for future episodes, right, Kevin?
like 12 episodes. I
Yeah,
just counted
right.
it in my brain right now. Do you do
Exactly.
anything around, you talk about the safety side of things and DOT inspections? You doing anything with chassis, intermodal chassis in that space?
Not really. That's one that gets so detailed.
Yeah.
Can't really do much with it where I can clearly say, I could publish this in an academic journal, because
Gotcha.
one of the challenges always is that, you know, is somebody who lives and breathes transportation, what I may think is interesting, a lot of my peers think is absolutely, the most boring thing they've ever had to deal with.
Right.
And so I'm having to literally sell every paper I write of, this is why it's important to talk about how spot rates evolve in the trucking sector.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
Chassis are important. They're not sexy, but they are incredibly important.
they
Oh,
are.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hey, also one other thing I wanted to get from you before we jump into tariffs. I know it's a tariff episode, but I keep thinking of other things. I'd love to get your. I don't want your secrets by any means or your strategy, but the way I know you and the way that we met is on LinkedIn. What's your LinkedIn philosophy, or are you on other social media out there as well, or is it only LinkedIn?
Only LinkedIn. I started doing that once COVID hit and there was a big thirst for a lot of information.
Yeah.
And I had just started doing some research before that, specifically using industry level data to understand driver turnover dynamics. The American Trucking Associations was kind enough to give me their research, or not research, but give me their data on industry level turnover.
Right.
And so we were starting to, work with some of that. And so I started getting familiar with some of the different government databases. And once COVID hit, there was this thirst for information about what was going on in the supply chain space. And so I started putting some content up, got a little bit of interest, and I hate to say it, but we had a lot more spare time. I was trying to learn and teach myself on the fly because my students were wanting to know what was going on. So I was teaching myself this, and it's like, well, as time went on, it's like I teach 100 people a year versus I can, build a following and get this information out much easier.
Yeah.
And I did actually go back and check and had noticed that for a lot of my executive education I was doing in 2018 and 2019, I was touching on a lot of these different data sources. And so I think part of it probably in my mind at the time was like, I'm doing this for exec ed and I'm teaching folks about the PPI for trucking. Why do I not share this? Because, you go back 6 years ago, I don't think a single news outlet ever talked about the producer price index for trucking. And now the data, just came out for November today, and you'll see a couple media outlets are going to be covering and talking about it.
Yep.
So, just, kind of being somebody to be a little bit of a data maven to just point people and say, look, there's a lot out here. We're not using it and our tax dollars pay for it. So why not take advantage of it?
Yeah. Please keep posting. I'm a fan. It's so valuable. It's so insightful. And I look for it on a frequent basis. And that's one of the reasons why. That is the reason why Kevin and I wanted to have you on and talk about some of your recent postings about tariffs. And I know there's a lot out there. There's a lot of articles. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of webinars and a lot of information out there, but I don't think it's ever too much. And I love the different perspectives. So maybe let's dive into, what are the tariffs? Give an elementary explanation for our listeners.
Yeah, so a tariff is a tax that is placed on a good when it enters the United States from another country. And specifically, that good is destined for essentially consumption in the United States. So if you import something but then export it again, you can actually get that money back that you paid for the tariff. It's called a duty drawback. Tariffs are as old as basically trade has existed, so it's not something that's a new idea. If you go back 130 years, it was one of the key forms of taxation that funded the U.S. federal government. So if you go back to like 1900, roughly 40% of federal taxation was tariffs. Today, that number is 1.8%. I had to look that figure up
You
last
are
night.
kidding.
Thank you for that number. I think that's ultra important
Wow.
for the audience and the
Yeah,
listeners.
just 1.8%. Yeah. And so this is one of, I think one of the biggest, not to cut ahead, but one of the biggest misnomers that has developed is this idea that maybe we could fund the federal government with tariffs.
Right.
And the easy example I give everybody is we import about $4 trillion of goods in a given year. I'm just going to use some rounding here, and if anything, round up and say $4 trillion. If you slap a universal 20% tariff on that, that gets me $800 billion in revenue. That sounds like a lot, except the Defense Department's budget last year was $820 billion. So with a 20% tariff on all of our imports, you don't even get the Department of Defense funded, let alone Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera.
Right. So real quick, who pays the tariff?
The importing party pays the tariff. The exporter does not pay the tariff. It is the importer. So it is the company with a location here in the United States that is paying that tariff.
So Jason, that has been that's fundamental. That's ultra important in the context of why most Americans believe that tariffs are good. Why is it that what's your opinion on why is it that aspect is not absorbed and digested in a way that we just did? That, hey, look, tariffs don't hurt anybody. They don't hurt the exporting country. It's truly the business that's paying to bring the goods into the United States and or the consumer. Why is that hard to understand?
So I think a lot of it has to do with a general misunderstanding that exists. And it's, a phrase I'll hear all the time is, we don't manufacture anything anymore. And so there's been this belief built up in the United States that we are not a manufacturing nation anymore, even though we are the world's second largest manufacturer. And an easy rule of thumb is 75 to 80% of the products consumed in the United States, either as capital investment or as personal consumption or as an intermediate input to a production process. So a cardboard box that Amazon uses to ship a product would be an example. 75 to 80% of the goods consumed in the United States are manufactured here in the United States. What happened is that certain product categories that people are familiar with going and buying at the store, especially a department store. So take apparel items, take linens, take, pots and pans and things like that. A lot of that is now produced overseas, whereas 50 years ago, it would have been made domestically here in the United States. And so, especially from about 2000 to 2003, we entered the turn of the millennium with a little over 17 million people employed in manufacturing plants in the United States. By 2003, that number was down to about 13 million. So we lost 4 million manufacturing jobs very, very, very quickly. A lot of that was production got offshored overseas. And it was for things like apparel. It was for things like assembling computers, like we're talking, we're on now. It was assembling telephones, printers, microwave ovens. So a lot of, consumer electronic appliances. And I think that really got into the American psyche. And it contributed to this narrative that we don't make anything anymore because people walk into a department store or Walmart or Target and they see made in China, made in Vietnam, et cetera, on so many of the goods. And that has created just this misconception. And so what I think it has done is it has created this desire to go back to the way things were. And somebody has come up with the idea, well, you know what, if we just make the imports more expensive, well, we'll just make it domestically in the United States without realizing that, well, that may sound like what's going to happen. When you really dive into the nuance, there's almost no chance for a lot of these product categories that it is cost effective anymore to make the goods in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yep. So what do you say? What do you say about retaliatory tariffs, in particular from the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa? What do you say about the potential of those retaliatory, tariffs being applied, and how that could affect U.S. exporters?
My statement is, ask any soybean farmer how 2019 was. It was a rough year because China tremendously reduced their amount of soybean purchases from the United States and instead started to source from Brazil. There's no doubt retaliatory tariffs are detrimental. We have multiple different academic studies. One group led by David Autor at MIT clearly documented that the industries that received tariff protection, the most tariff protection by the 2018-2019 China tariffs, they actually did not expand their payrolls any more than any other manufacturing industry. So it wasn't like, for example, steel mills magically added a lot more employment than the auto assemblers did. That's not what happened. But the industries targeted for retaliation actually shed payrolls. So agriculture, beverage manufacturing, specifically the manufacturers that are producing beverages for where there's more export penetration. So retaliatory tariffs are real. It's trade data is so visible. It's very easy to know what you target. And so it can make it quite easy for countries to retaliate in these instances. And so that's one of the additional complexities to this. The other thing to think about with retaliation is when you look at the data for who imports into the United States. If you just look at manufacturing firms, we've got like 240,000 manufacturing companies in the United States, give or take. So a huge number. Of those 240,000, roughly 1,500 to 1,500 of them. So we're talking less than 1%, almost a 0.5%. That 0.5% accounts for 70% of the imports done by manufacturers and 75% of our exports. And a tremendous amount of that trade is what we call related party trade, which means that it comes from one entity where there's an equity relationship with the other entity. Okay. And so 98% of auto imports and exports, as an example, motor vehicle imports and exports, 98% of finished vehicle import and exports are related party trade because it's GM bringing in vehicles from Mexico. It's Ford bringing in vehicles from Canada. It's Toyota bringing in some vehicles from Japan, even though they have a massive production presence here in the United States.
No, that blows my mind. I mean, that's good data. That's good information.
So you mentioned
I can't take credit for that. That's thanks to some great economists. Those facts about the related party trade come from a economist at Dartmouth named Teresa Fort.
Thanks, Teresa. So you mentioned the auto industry, and a couple others. So is there an industry that's more impacted or exposed to tariffs?
So it would depend on how you want to think about what is like exposure mean. Mm-hmm. So as an example, as a consumer, if you buy a cell phone, that thing's made overseas. Mm-hmm. So almost, the vast majority of cell phones are going to be produced overseas. So that would be certainly if you have a global tariff, almost every cell phone that somebody uses is going to be hit. Same way with computers, apparel, etc. If you want to zero in on a U.S. manufacturing sector that is exposed, especially if we get Canada and Mexico in the mix, there's nothing more exposed than the auto sector. Just the amount of cross-border trade we have is phenomenally large. Just as some statistics, in 2023, Michigan imported $40 billion of finished vehicles from Mexico. And that's because those imports are being, are the big three with their facilities here in Michigan. And so you start seeing these numbers that are just phenomenally large. And the amount of parts trade that goes across the border is quite incredible. And so you can't get around just how intertwined in North America the auto sector is, but even how intertwined it is globally. I mean, Japan exports a tremendous amount of auto parts to the U.S. that are put in vehicles that are made here. The same with Germany for their plants in South Carolina and Alabama.
So I want to real quick, Jason and KP, tariffs are the big, it's the news headline, right? So that's what they talk about in the news headline. But for those of us that have been in this business, really what it boils down to is the duty rate. Is that right? So the tariff is where the duty rate is stored. And so when you import something, it has a duty rate. It could be 10%, it could be 1%, it could be 100%. And then the tariff is what regulates what percentage that duty rate is, right?
Yep, exactly. When you say I'm putting a 10% tariff, you're saying, okay, the duty rate goes up by 10%. So
yeah. Now, what about, KP, I don't want to go too far, but what about anti-dumping duty rates? That's a big thing that we've all talked about and all had in our lives, but what is that different than, what we hear on the news as far as a tariff?
Yeah, so when we talk about anti-dumping duties, those are specific investigations that have been done to look and say, okay, this good from this specific country seems to be being sold at below a reasonable cost. So essentially, it's being dumped. You're selling a product for less than what it costs you. I will admit the research on the effectiveness of anti-dumping duties to, let's say, spur improvements in U.S. manufacturers is very, very, very not encouraging. From a standpoint of the logic for the anti-dumping duty is saying this good is being sold below cost here in the United States. That is unfair to U.S. manufacturers. Okay. We're going to put a tax on this. So we're going to double, if it costs $1,000 a unit, we're going to put $100 tax on it. So effectively now it costs $2,000 a unit. And the logic is that protection will help the U.S. manufacturing firms invest in better capital, better capital to become more productive. They'll invest in quality, et cetera. The largest scale study that was done of what manufacturers actually do when they receive anti-dumping duty protection was basically make the products that they are less actually productive at making and just increase their prices.
Yeah.
And so it's unfortunate that there is actually minimal evidence of a societal welfare benefit for anti-dumping duties because a lot of manufacturers don't take those duties as a chance to make improvements such that if we would remove those tariffs, they would be more competitive in the market.
Right.
So that gets me to, thank you for that. That gets me to, we'll get the crystal ball out in a little bit. But so 2018, there were exemptions made. What's your thought on exemptions in this environment, the likelihood, and how de minimis plays into that in somewhat of a different environment, with Temu and others in existence today that weren't necessarily there in 2018?
Yeah, so I'm going to put this in sort of two different buckets. So first off, the exemptions and what I'm going to call the industrial importing piece. I really can't fathom that the Trump administration wants to tariff Canadian oil. The Midwest refiners don't really have a plan B because we don't have the pipeline capacity to bring the oil up from Texas here. And the Canadian oil is a different consistency. And for folks not listening who may not have a background in chemistry, you have to gear an oil refinery to run oil of certain viscosity and consistency. So you can't just buy oil from anywhere. You gear your refinery to run certain types of oil.
Makes sense. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't just swap out Canadian heavy crude, which is a lot of what we refine in the Midwest, for West Texas Intermediary, which is a light sweet crude. So it's not it's not as easy of a switch as folks may think when they say, well, it's just oil. That doesn't quite work that way. I certainly could see exemptions trying to be granted. Here's the challenge, though, is the more exemptions you grant, the less teeth you put in the tariff. So a good example was one of the products that got exempted with tariffs from China in 2018, 2019 was cell phones. And guess what? Our biggest import is from China on a dollar value basis, folks. It's cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
So you put that exemption in there, and all of a sudden, that tariff's a little bit less effective.
But I did what I said. I put the tariffs in place. And the small print is there are exemptions of exactly what you just described.
And my biggest concern about this process is, for lack of a better term, it breeds cronyism. It breeds trying to play favoritism in order to get those exemptions. Because if I'm an importer of $1 billion a year and I'm staring a 40% tariff in the face, that tells me right now I got $400 million that I could go spend lobbying and doing other stuff.
Yeah.
And so that is one of the huge concerns I have. I could see exemptions being granted. I mean, it's just very hard to know. We had a ton of exemptions granted last time. We've had discussion. There won't be exemptions this time, but we'll see how that goes. On the de minimis side, that to me, that is a whole nother issue, but certainly related. And for folks listening who may not be familiar what we're talking about, if you as an individual bring in under $800 a day from another country, the Census Bureau and more specifically Customs and Border Patrol, who collects the tariffs, basically says, we don't care about you because $800 a day means nothing to us. What that has meant historically is that you buy something from China that comes, from Xi'an, so let's say ultra fast fashion, or Temu, which is kind of like cheap Amazon.
Yep.
If you want to think about it.
I love it.
And we're just going to ignore this. This box can just come in. It doesn't have the items being brought in, don't have 10-digit harmonized tariff schedule codes attached to them, which is how we assign those tariffs and duties on the products. So basically just let it in and it gets distributed. The challenge is...
So does de minimis explode at that point in time?
Oh, it has. So de minimis shipments right now are over $1 billion a year for the United States, which is a just phenomenally large amount. It's 3 million a day when you break that down. And unfortunately, there have been, and where the big explosion is, it's de minimis shipments from China. Let's not kid ourselves. It's items that Americans are buying from Xi'an and Temu primarily, that are being essentially the business model has been up until more recently. You buy from Xi'an or Temu, you can expect a 2-week lead time, give or take. So let's say 9 to 15 days at least. Yep. And what they're doing is they're getting enough orders that they can then tell their suppliers, who, by the way, they're forcing to hold a lot of inventory. So that's kind of one of the stories about this. The Wall Street Journal's done some articles. Xi'an and Temu are not necessarily the nicest to their vendors because they're forcing them to hold a lot of inventory to make this business model work. But we can collect enough demand that we can fill up airplanes, entire freighters each day, throw those over to the U.S., and then we're just going to put those parcels in, distributed, post office, UPS, FedEx. There's now a company called SpeedX. It's the ultra low cost, delivery, poor reliability, but super cheap. So that had been the business model, and it had essentially been built around leveraging this de minimis exemption because each of these packages is typically under $800 a day. The challenge has been de minimis is one way to avoid tariffs. So that's one problem. Another problem is it's a way to get goods that cannot be brought into the U.S. So, for example, apparel products from one of the Chinese provinces where forced labor of the Uyghur community is a key concern. And then also, unfortunately, de minimis is being used to bring a lot of drugs like fentanyl into the United States. And so there has been a push. The Biden administration started it. I'm expecting the Trump administration to continue it, to essentially really crack down on these shipments. So items have to have 10-digit harmonized tariff schedule codes on them. as an example, is one of the proposals moving forward.
Sure.
What we've seen as well at the same time, though, is Shein and Temu have started to realize that customers don't want 9 to 15-day lead times. They want stuff shorter. So Shein is actually starting to open warehouses in the United States. They're planning on having 3 facilities, one in Cali, one in Indianapolis, one in the Northeast. Temu's opening warehouses and going to, I'm going to say, the Amazon type of fulfillment model. Bring goods in by water, get it to the warehouse, and then fulfill demand as it, becomes apparent from the U.S. for the fastest moving of items. So essentially, we're even seeing Shein and Temu moving away from the de minimis model even before the loophole was closing, just because the competitive dynamics of the industry were necessitating that they shift how they operated.
Yeah.
Because when they do that, when they start to open up those fulfillment centers here in the U.S., those shipments no longer are, a $45 shipment coming to Kevin Higgins and a $75 shipment going to Kevin Parkerson. It is a multi-$1,000 shipment going to their facility. So then they're subject to the duty rates that apply from the tariffs on that product.
Yep, exactly. And so basically you have the irony of the market process and Americans wanting shorter and shorter lead times, essentially causing that former fulfillment model that was leveraging this loophole becoming, for certain items, less attractive. So so goods brought in through, I'm going to say, the traditional global sourcing retail trade model, those are all going to be properly tariffed, properly taxed, and whatnot. So it does add visibility. It also makes the e-commerce game more interesting because now Amazon is squeezed on 2 sides between Walmart with 5,000 mini fulfillment centers around the country called their stores, but now lower cost rivals who are now going to better be able to compete on a couple day lead time.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow.
That's
listen,
wild.
Jason, we let in with this is a hot topic. Everybody's talking about it, but what other aspect of this topic should we be talking about that no one seems to be talking about? What is there another aspect of you're like, but what about this? And it doesn't seem to be getting much traction. Is there anything?
Yeah, so I would say probably one of the biggest ones is that so much of our trade is what we call related party trade. And I've mentioned the term already, but it basically means that you have an entity in the United States that is importing from another entity for which there is some share of equity ownership effectively. So there's a specific definition, but just think about it. There's some degree of shared ownership here.
Mm-hmm.
Same way a lot of our exports are related party trade. And so when you really look at U.S. trade, it is not many companies account for a disproportionate amount of global trade. And that makes sense because there's this huge fixed cost up front to do this stuff. And so if you are a small mom and pop wholesaler, unless your specialty is bringing in, sweets from Europe for the holiday season, and that's what you built your business on, chances are you're not going to want to touch this international stuff. You're going to buy from some bigger entity that plays in this space. And so what you end up getting is the more we have tensions for global trade, it disproportionately hurts the largest U.S. companies, which tend to pay the highest wages, which tend to be the most productive, and also tend to be the best managed, believe it or not. There's very strong evidence that firms involved in global trade are actually better managed than firms that are not.
Touche. Yeah.
Interesting. So, KP, I don't know what you had next, but I just one of the things that I keep my circle of people that I talk to on a day-to-day basis, we talk about is, and these tariffs are, they can be inflationary or they can be a negotiating tactic and you're going to do something else. So are they one or the other, or are they potentially both in this regard? Because I know, there's a lot of discussion about the new administration and where they're going with tariffs. And we know that 2018, especially this steel tariff, we saw that shift. We saw, marine chassis shift to Vietnam, and then there were Chinese components. And so they were looking at, oh, you're using Chinese components, so they're still subject to the duty rate. So what would you say to people about, they can be inflationary or they are a negotiating tactic? What are your thoughts around that, Jason?
Well, so what I'd say is if you implement a tariff and you raise the cost of imports, that by definition is inflationary. If it's a product that's being produced overseas because it's not economical to make it in the United States, common sense should tell you if we start making it in the United States, it's going to cost more money than the product that we imported from overseas without the tariff. So the arguments, that this is not inflationary, that it just doesn't pass muster. We've had multiple economic studies that have indicated that there was tariff pass-through onto the ultimate buyers. So, for example, the consumer. The one exception that people seem to gravitate to was steel. So price of imported steel did fall after the tariffs, but steel is a unique one in that 75 to 85% of the steel we consume here is made here. And guess what happened to the price of domestic steel? That stuff went up 20 to 30% over the same time period. So any decrease in the price of international steel was more than offset by the fact that our steel mills started charging a little bit more during that period. And if you take a look from 2011 till 2019, the best year for profitability for U.S. steel mills was 2018. That's not ironic, or that I shouldn't say that is not a coincidence, to say the least.
Yeah.
So if implemented, they certainly are going to be inflationary. Where I'll disagree with folks about is some people say, well, it's only, let's say, the cost of a manufactured good that a wholesaler buys and the wholesaler sells it to a retailer sells it to a consumer. There's a constituency out there that says, well, if the tariff causes the price of this thing to go up $2, then the wholesaler just sells it for $2 more, and then the retailer sells it for $2 more. And so the price increase isn't that much. I call absolute shenanigans on that argument because that's not how wholesaling works. I did wholesaling. That's not how it works. That thing got $2 more expensive to me. How do I reprice it? I say, what's my gross margin rate? Oh, I got to make 30%. 2 divided by 0.7. That's how much I raise my price. Why? Because if I don't make my gross margin rate, my boss gets mad.
100%.
And so what you end up getting is essentially full pass-through, in some cases pass-through plus, onto the end consumer.
Right.
And so that is an aspect that gets, a little bit of disagreement on. But in general, wholesalers got to make their gross margin rates. Retailers got to make their gross margin rates. Walmart's gross margin rate today is right where it was in 2019.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really look like they were absorbing any additional costs and not passing that on. So they are inflationary if implemented in a kind of a blanket across the board manner. Can they be a negotiating tactic? Absolutely. Yeah. We do have an advantage in that, we import so much. We typically, for a lot of these countries, are running bilateral trade deficits. That gives us a little bit of negotiating room. But where we'll push back a little bit is say U.S. exports are shockingly concentrated in just a few industry sectors.
Right.
And so all of a sudden somebody has to say, you know what? I think Boeing airplanes just need to become 35% more expensive. And there you have it, with a important share of our export just became a lot less attractive, and Airbus sitting over in Europe and say, we'll take those planes. Thank you very much. Or paper products and industries like that, where we're very competitive. We export a lot, but these can be easily targeted. Plastic resins would be another key. That would be one of the biggest ones I would expect, to see retaliatory tariffs. And so the fact retaliation exists does reduce a little bit of the negotiating, power. What I tell anybody in the trucking space was, if you thought tariffs were that effective, then why did we have a freight recession in 2019 in the United States? So we do have a little bit of a tail of the tape, and the 2019 was not a good year for trucking. And so when folks get, I'll see folks get excited and say this is going to lead to a resurgence of U.S. manufacturing. It's like 2019, our manufacturing output was lower than what it was in 2018 when we had the higher tariffs in place. The next thing I'll get is, well, it takes time to build manufacturing plants. It's like, yeah, sure, it does, but it doesn't take that much time for an existing plant to add a line if they want to do that. And that's the first natural solution if you're going to produce a product. You may not be building a new plant. You may add a line to an existing facility. Why manufacturing output not increase then in 2019? Mm-hmm. So I'm just quite skeptical. And if you look at every major sector where we did have a lot of offshoring 24, 25 years ago, not one of them has shown substantial signs yet of reshoring or substantial increases in output, which is why my attitude is much more, we need sensible government policy that helps us grow the manufacturing base for which we are globally competitive. So let's cut the ridiculous regulations. Let's cut our business taxes to make ourselves more competitive. Let's find ways to improve our education, especially vocational education. Let's find ways to get folks work visas if they need them. Because I've worked in a manufacturing plant. There's a reason I'm a professor not working in a manufacturing plant.
Right.
It's not fun.
Yeah.
And so I think, to me, my attitude is you have to say, how do you have sensible rules that grow the output in the industries for which we're competitive. And I hate to say it, but trying to isolate ourselves from the world with tariffs isn't the solution for that.
Well, that gets me to probably, one of our last questions is really get the crystal ball out. How do you see this really playing out? We'll have this recorded. So a year from now, we'll play it back. How do you think this is going to play out? What's going to happen?
So I think I don't see any way we're not going to have more tariffs on Chinese goods. I do see that one coming. I do wonder with the exceptions because, again, all I got to do is point to a couple fairly narrow categories. And if I give exemptions, the consumer doesn't feel nearly as much pain. And that becomes more politically advantageous, but it also reduces the negotiating leverage with China. So that is the key thing from the political side. If you really want to, let's say, negotiate hard with China, you got to be willing to tariff cell phones. Like that is the one category. It's just, I can't stress enough how important it is. You have to be willing, if you're the Trump administration, if you really want to take it to China on this, you have to say iPhones are 60% more expensive. I don't know if that is politically palpable. I'm just being honest.
Yep.
Canada and Mexico, I can't fathom we're going to do a tariff war with those countries. It does not make sense from an inflationary standpoint. And more than anything, the industry that is the most affected, it's the one that my home state functions on. It's the auto sector.
Sure.
And I hate to say it, that's one of those blue states that can flip from time to time. And so the political calculus of causing chaos in the domestic auto industry in the U.S. is just doesn't make sense. Anything that increases the price of steel hurts the metal bending industries. And I think I had posted on LinkedIn sometime in mid-December. There's 1 million people involved in auto production. There's 1.6 million people involved in fabricated metal production. There's over 1 million people who make machinery in the U.S. There's 80,000 people at all of our steel mills. So on a cost-benefit analysis, you make steel more expensive, let's say targeting the 25% or so that we import. You hurt 3+ million manufacturing jobs. And you're trying to protect 80,000 jobs. And frankly, the decision not to sell U.S. steel, we can play this back in a year from now, but I do believe that if U.S. Steel is not allowed to sell to Nippon, I think the Mons Valley facility in Pennsylvania is gone within 2 years here.
Yeah.
And that'll be the most iconic of our steel mills, maybe other than the Gary Works in Indiana. And so I can see China, lots of tariffs. I don't see it with Canada and Mexico. I don't know about the rest of the world situation. And from an inflation standpoint, it's really hard to read the tea leaves for next year. We have stubbornly persistent core inflation. A lot of that is the shelter component. We've been expecting that to come down, but it's just not coming down as fast as we would like.
Yeah.
And so that's raising a lot of concerns that anything that could be inflationary next year. The Federal Reserve, for folks who are trying to understand what's the Fed thinking, the Fed has a chronic concern of repeating the late 1970s, where they cut interest rates too soon in retrospect, and they didn't get inflation under control. And while we had some phenomenal economic output years from 1976 through 1978, like absolutely phenomenal output in terms of housing construction, steel production, and basically every industry, we also had really high inflation.
Yep.
And that's when the Volcker came in to the Fed, and they put interest rates above 19% at a couple points in time. And so they literally killed the economy, put us into the deepest recession at that time since the Great Depression to get inflation under control.
Yep.
The Fed is chronically terrified of repeating that episode. Yeah. So what I would say to folks is, if we get to the middle of 2025 and core inflation is not closer to 2%, and let's say it's edging up from where it is right now, Fed's going to put the hammer down. They're going to raise rates again. And so like that's the one thing. And you can even see some of the professional forecasters, they're actually predicting that. There's a couple folks now who their chart for where they think the Fed funds rate will be at by the end of 2026 is anticipating rate increases by Q3 and Q4 25.
Wow.
And so, that's the one thing I'm really watching the most closely, because especially for the freight markets, if interest rates start going up, we've got some really nice tailwinds coming into 25. I hope Congress doesn't screw this up somehow. I don't trust either party not to. But we've got some nice tailwinds coming in. But if inflation rears its ugly head, you're going to see the Fed put the hammer back down, start raising rates. And all of a sudden, you'll see that capital investment side of the economy, like housing activity and machinery investment, it'll start to slow down again. And freight will start to slow accordingly.
Yeah. And there's not a lot of people, man, I remember that because, I was just a kid, but, I remember it being such a tough time. My dad, we sold big cars, V8 engine cars, and my mom was driving a Volkswagen. And because the interest rates were high and gas price was high, we had a lot of stuff going against us back in that time frame.
My dad worked for White Motor before they went belly up, and my mom had worked for a company called Ryan Homes, which was selling housing. You can imagine how joyous that was with 18% mortgage rates. And so, the late 1970s, early 1980s were not a good period in the U.S. economy. That's why the Fed is terrified of persistently high inflation. And, we saw how that has affected the consumer psyche and the voter psyche here in the United States. Is even with, inflation in comparison to the 70s really coming down a lot, people are still really upset that things are 20 and 30% more expensive than they were 5 years ago. And they're not getting cheaper.
No.
And, I think the country's psyche, if we'd have inflation go back to 4 or 5%, I think that would be incredibly damaging to where folks would be at.
Sure.
Yeah. We need that relief. We're paying, 3 times what we were paying for a half a gallon of milk in 2019, and same for eggs. And people just we need some relief, just a little bit. We don't need huge relief, but.
Well, with that, this topic is a very important topic, and this has been great, Jason. We'll definitely want to have you back, as this develops and evolves. But thanks for sharing your expertise, perspective on this current tariff environment, your knowledge of trade policy and the impact that it has on the global logistics is truly, sheds light on the challenges and the opportunities facing, the industry today. So,
AKP, before you bug out, I want to tell all of our listeners, if they're just listening, you need to go and watch this episode on YouTube, or you need to watch it on Spotify, because this guy, aside from being an incredible expert and a wonderful guest, got one of the most killer mustaches of anybody that I've ever had.
I wondered how you were going to weave the mustache.
No. I'm just telling you, everybody needs to go watch this. And so it's a killer mustache. I appreciate you coming on. I have some mustache envy right now. So,
well, this is great. Thanks, Jason, very much. And until next time, thanks everyone.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Kev Talks, Real World Global Logistics. If today's discussion inspired you, don't forget to follow, subscribe, rate, and share our podcast.
Remember, every great journey in logistics starts with a single step forward. Let's continue working together to transform the industry.